Hi, Solarpunks. Welcome to today's Solarpunk Presents bonus chat. I'm Ariel,
And I'm Christina.
and our topic today is Studio Ghibli's 1988 film My Neighbor Totoro as a prototype for solarpunk storytelling.
Just one thought before we dive into the bonus episode, and that is we need your support. So subscribe to our YouTube channel, like our videos, join our Patreon. And now, here we go.
My Neighbor Totoro is an engaging study in how to find drama in a utopian setting without resorting to the in-your-face, over-the-top types of conflict and tension that pervade dystopian and post-apocalyptic and a whole lot of other types of fiction.
To give you a quick overview, My Neighbor Totoro has next to no plot, or at least as far as I can see. The setting is the 1950s in a rural area of Japan outside of Tokyo, but within commuting distance by a kind of very slow rickety bus. A young father moves into a dusty old house in the midst of the fertile countryside with his two daughters, one 4, one 10. Their pretty, young mother has been hospitalized nearby with an illness whose nature is never made clear to us, but you get the feeling that it's serious and that she's been in the hospital for a long time.
The movie is mainly about the life that they settle into, so getting to know the neighboring peasants, going to work or school, exploring the forest, and finding and being found by Totoro, an enormous furry kami, or spirit king of the forest, who lives in an ancient camphor tree in a Shinto shrine at the top of a steep hill near the house.
The closest My Neighbor Totoro comes to having a plot, aside from the question hanging over the entire movie of whether the girl's mother is going to get well and come home or if she's going to die, is when the 4-year-old goes missing for the second time and everybody has to search for her, to the point of dredging the local pond for her body, which sounds a lot more dramatic than it actually was in the movie.
I thought it was pretty dramatic. I was sitting in fear for her.
Okay.
But for the most part, yeah, My Neighbor Totoro is about young children, so problems are child-sized, like new house, sick mother, new friendship, getting along with your neighbors, responsibility for your younger sister, moderating your emotions, even when someone you love is being very frustrating, mysteries, the threat of being lost is very small, very defenseless little person, the fear of losing a child. They're all very human things, more human-sized than anything else. Notice it's not teen-sized, though. No love drama or crushes, no puberty angst, no danger from the opposite sex or conflict with parents or authority figures.
Well, the girls aren't there yet. They're 4 and 10. And their world is one where they are loved and, accommodated. People let them be who they need to be, and for the most part, do what they need to do. Transgressions against the rules are minor, and for the most part, the adults are understanding about it. And the adults are happy to humor and maybe even believe the two girls when they talk about having seen fantastic, impossible things.
May, the 4-year-old, is in conflict with Oba-chan, the elderly peasant neighbor who serves as substitute grandmother, a lot.
Oh, well, conflict is a strong word to use here. It's more like May is a strong-willed and stubborn toddler who knows what she wants and has the confidence and determination to go for it, whether you like it or not. It's not like she's a teenager resenting the entire structure of authority, dictating her life, etc. Although she's clearly going to be quite a teenager someday. But but I actually really like the way they depict the grandmother type, the substitute grandmother figure, because she looks exactly the way a little kid would imagine one of these people, right? Like she's all the adults are very idealized images of adults, the handsome young father, the pretty young mother, and then this hag of a grandmother, this friendly hag of a grandmother.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I think the fact that she's not perfect makes her so much more approachable and more human, honestly, less
She
like an
is
archetype.
she is quite a character.
So what also makes this child size is the mystery and wonder and magic of an unknown world that we can't quite grasp, represented in Totoro, who is a powerful but seemingly benevolent manifestation of a kami. May first thinks of him as being the troll from the Three Billy Goats Gruff children's book that she and her sister liked to read.
But Totoro is very obviously not a troll in the Western fairy tale sense of troll. which are nasty, violent, human-eating things who slither about by night because the light of day turns them into the enormous boulders left behind by the Fennoscandian ice sheet as it retreated at the end of the last ice age, and other enormous, sometimes contortedly humanoid-looking bits of solid rock peeking out of the otherwise fairly barren landscape of Scandinavia.
And of course, nobody can see Totoro but the two little girls, although the father appears to completely believe his daughters when they talk about Totoro, and he insists on paying respects to the giant camphor tree that Totoro lives in at the Shinto shrine. Well, and respects to Totoro as well. He seems to acknowledge that there's a world next to ours, but it's also not a big deal for him. He doesn't have direct interaction with it, like he can't see it, and it's not top of mind for him. It's just a small part of his larger mundane life as a university professor.
What struck me about this movie, from the opening moments all the way through to the end, was that what this movie is about is joy. These two little girls are the epitome of joy. They're absolutely irrepressible, shrieking and laughing and running around everywhere, being amazed by the delightfulness of everything. Like all little kids would be in a perfect world without war, hunger, trauma, bad parenting, etc., and so forth.
I'll take that a step further and say that given the potential death of their mother, who is very much absent from their lives on a day-to-day basis, which, hangs over the whole movie, this movie is also about living life fearlessly and with joy and conscious appreciation of beauty, magic, and wonder, even in the face of difficult situations, like even potentially tragic and traumatizing ones. The two little girls have an amazing amount of agency. When there are problems, like May going missing or their mother being sick, the girls never question whether or not they're up to tackling these problems. They just do it. And that kind of confidence is amazing.
Oh, yeah, Jesus, as a kid, I wouldn't even ask a stranger for the time because I wasn't worthy of bothering them. And I'm not really sure I've grown out of that either.
I wouldn't have asked a stranger for the time because I was taught on multiple occasions, very specifically, that all strangers were dangerous. Like, if they didn't say the passphrase to me, then I wasn't to let them near me. This is the part of the 90s childhood that they don't like to talk about, the whole stranger danger thing.
Yeah, back in the 70s, we also got the talks on don't get into a stranger's car, even if they say I've sent them to get you because I've been hospitalized or whatever. Or, if anyone touches you down there, you come straight to me and let me know. But somehow, wow, and not being the greatest dot connector, I guess, I never made the leap from there to all strangers are dangerous.
Mm.
Although as an adult, I do sort of walk through the world thinking that not only are all strangers dangerous, in the event of the collapse of law or, the onset of fascist dictatorship, at least a couple of my neighbors would be willing to murder me, either directly or by turning me in. And they're not even strangers, right? Yeah, but that's also the lived experience of both the European and the Mexican side of my family, if you go back 80 to 100 years. And who even knows what happened in the centuries before that? But it must have certainly involved, conquest and pogroms. I feel like fear of other human beings has been epigenetically etched deeply into my DNA, and no amount of actual peaceful life with more positive than negative encounters with other people is going to change that.
Frankly, I think that makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary standpoint, like that your gut instinct is to be on guard and suspicious in case of danger. But part of what makes us human, I think, is being able to recognize instinct, set it aside, and do something else. It's like being brave. Being brave isn't the same as being fearless. It's being afraid and then still doing the scary thing anyway.
But to get back to joy, beauty, magic, and wonder, one of the other bits of media I've recently consumed, and gosh, that is an awful way to put it, was the novel Shogun by James Clavell, which involves a European sort of crash landing in feudal Japan in the year 1600 in the midst of the political, religious, and military intrigue leading up to the Battle of, and I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, Sekigahara,
No,
which
you did
was,
actually pronounce it pretty
woo,
well.
okay, go me.
Sekigahara?
So this battle was the largest and most important battle of Japanese feudal history. And this setting, which involves a lot of Machiavellian manipulation, violence and maneuvering, and honor, and people being ordered to commit seppuku in order to save face after one failing or another, is anything but the idyllic utopian setting of My Neighbor Totoro. Yet Shogun also left me with a profound appreciation for facing life with joy, beauty, and deep appreciation for harmony. I find it so interesting that you can convey the same thesis, in a sense, from either extreme. My Neighbor Totoro does it delightfully in an hour and a half in a slice of the lives of two giggling children, and Shogun takes like 1150 bloody pages filled with countless betrayals and beheadings, and even slowly boils one character to death. And all that, even though it ends before the actual battle begins. And yet you get to the same place somehow with both of these pieces, with both of these works.
Being boiled alive slowly. Yeah. Uh,
Times were different back then.
they were. They were. But I think I see what you're saying. It's in part the same message, just aimed at very different audiences. And honestly, I couldn't shake the knowledge about the shadow of war over this entire film. Like, it's supposed to be set in post-World War II Japan. Not only has the country been firebombed and suffered two nuclear attacks, which I'm sure the adults are still struggling to comprehend at this point, but also the entire structure of their government changed overnight. Like one minute they were an empire, and the next they were a quote unquote democracy with a constitution that was written up basically at gunpoint and a permanent American army base presence to make sure that they behave themselves. But May and Sasuke don't know this, so how could they? So they carry on with their lives and all the joys and sorrows of just being human.
So of course, My Neighbor Totoro was made in the mid to late 1980s. So that's 40 years after all that. And Hayao Miyazaki was born in 1941. So you'd think he'd probably have very few memories of the war. I mean, my mom was also born in 41. She doesn't remember a thing about it. She was born in Europe. So you'd think that Miyazaki would have few memories of the war, of the dropping of the atomic bombs, and of living in an empire. But I was curious enough to check his Wikipedia page, and it mentions that one of his first memories is of the firebombing of, yeah, here's another one I'm going to get wrong, Utsunomiya.
Utsunomiya.
Utsunomiya. Okay. And this was a town that his family had been evacuated to from Tokyo. And in July 1945, the US dropped 800 tons of incendiary cluster bombs and napalm bombs on this town, igniting a firestorm, ultimately destroying 44% of the town. 1,150 people were severely injured, and 630 people died. Also, 9,500 buildings were destroyed, instantly rendering 50,000 people homeless.
What an incredibly horrible thing to have your earliest memories of that. That really sheds light on, frankly, his entire career and Studio Ghibli's pretty consistent anti-war messaging.
Yeah, I mean, that must have been an absolutely terrifying, horrific experience, especially when you're just a couple of years old at the time, and, it doesn't take much to terrify a little person.
Yeah, and to have that be like a foundational childhood memory, like,
Yeah.
what was
Yeah,
your
no,
childhood?
so my mom doesn't have any memories of her time in France during the war, living in fear of deportation to a concentration camp the
Mm,
entire time because I think it was so traumatizing. She just doesn't retain those memories.
I mean, different people react in different ways, I suppose, to different things.
Still, I think it's remarkable that he remembers that. And so what that means is that Miyazaki must have been pretty cognizant of what his parents' generation would have gone through intellectually, psychologically, and emotionally in the decade or two after World War II. And the other thing I learned from Wikipedia is that between 1947 and 1955, Miyazaki's mother suffered from spinal tuberculosis and was often hospitalized, which sheds considerable light onto what was going on with the mother in My Neighbor Totoro.
Ah,
Yeah, this is pretty autobiographical here, right? We all think of tuberculosis as being that thing that kills you really fast by invading your lungs, but there's actually several different types of tuberculosis. And in this type, you end up with progressively worsening arthritis of the spine. Okay, you can still die of it, and people still do die of this type of tuberculosis, even today. Although today this is mainly due to lack of treatment or because of multi-drug resistant strains.
mm.
I'm not sure how people would recover from tuberculosis in this time before we had a good handle on using antibiotics. So, up to a first couple of years after the end of World War II, right? So I know my dad's uncle died in Los Angeles of the more stereotypical form of tuberculosis, also a few years after the end of World War II, because I guess they hadn't really yet figured out how to use antibiotics to fight TB.
Mm.
And a little bit of trivia here that none of you actually really needs to know, but my dad, who was forced to visit his uncle in the sanatorium during his uncle's last months, got exposed to the bacterium, but thankfully never contracted the disease. So to this day, and he's 88 years old now, he tests positive on tuberculosis tests, and he always has to get a chest x-ray if he has to show that he doesn't have TB.
Wow. Whew, history.
Well,
Sometimes
we
we
forget
forget.
how infectious life used to be, even until quite
Yeah,
recently.
yeah. And we forget how lucky some of us have it. And yet we spend so much of our peaceful, easy freedom dreaming of the heroes we'd be if only we lived in a violent, militaristic, post-apocalyptic dystopia.
Yeah, without antibiotics.
Yeah, I know. We don't have like
Yeah,
cheap.
anyways, syphilis, I don't know. It's so weird though, isn't
Yes,
it? It's like,
all the road warriors, suffering from syphilis. I mean, I laugh,
oh,
but that's terrible.
yeah, but it's gallows humor, right? But it is weird. It's like we're like cats who want to come inside so we can look out the window at how much better and more interesting things are outside.
Meanwhile, probably a lot of people who live in actual violent dystopias spend a lot of time thinking about what kind of people they'd be and what kind of lives they'd be able to live if only they lived in a stable and affluent democracy.
Yeah. To go back a few thoughts, and maybe to go forward a bit to wondering about how cultures and systems change. The whole weird My Neighbor Totoro slash Shogun parallel in my life this week has had me wondering how Japan got from finding joy and wonder in life by accepting death and by shoehorning themselves into extreme hierarchy with rigid social roles, rules, and etiquette, breaches of which were punishable by death, to Hello Kitty or My Neighbor Totoro, which retains the eye for wonder and beauty and meaning in life, but has ditched all the hard, cold, brutal bits.
Well, there are 400 years between 1600 and now, and it's not like Europe wasn't also horribly hierarchical at the time, full of war and prone to decapitating people or burning them at the stake sometimes, just for having ideas that the people in power didn't like, despite the fact that it was also the time period when Shakespeare wrote plays like Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream, which feels surprisingly modern. And despite all the war and conflict and disease in this era, well, I mean, what advanced delights has the contemporary moment got to give us on par with Hello Kitty and My Neighbor Totoro?
From Europe? The Spice Girls? I mean, I'd say Appenzeller cheese, but the Swiss have been making that for at least 700 years.
The Spice Girls were like 35 years ago, though. I'd argue that it's like Drag Race or maybe Eurovision at this
Oh
point.
God. Ah, um, oh, but oh my, you just made me feel old. And I'm sorry, but Eurovision is older than the Spice Girls. Um,
Oh, really?
yeah.
But they have outlasted them.
ABBA won Eurovision one year. And it
Wow.
wasn't the first year of Eurovision. That was 1956. It's been
Wow.
around a while. Okay. But you make me feel old here. The Spice Girls were after my time. Although, at the end of my 20s, I did briefly see a guy who thought the Spice Girls were the greatest. And I have to admit, I did once frown at him thinking, what's wrong with you, sir? Incidentally, he was Croatian. And one time, I remember him staring at me in something between disbelief and disgust when I said I'd never heard gunfire before moving to Oakland, which I had moved to about 6 months earlier. And of course, he was Croatian and had probably had to fight in the Croatian War of Independence only a couple of years earlier. And I have to say, I often forget how many people, men especially, I have known, even a pretty big chunk of the ones I grew up with in Southern California, have had to fight in wars of one kind or another. Even in this time that many of us have the privilege of thinking as being unprecedentedly peaceful, if on the brink of, falling into
Mm.
total chaos. Anyway, one of the Croatian fellow's greatest points of national pride was that even in the midst of the Civil War, you could sit in the sun at one of the tables in front of cafes in Zagreb and enjoy an excellent coffee.
I'm talking about embracing joy despite the circumstances, but maybe it's embracing joy because of the circumstances. Like the horrors and violence of everyday life make the joys, even the small ones, so much more poignant and worth celebrating. finding something that makes you happy and that just celebrates the irrepressible joy of being alive is maybe made a little bit more important to you by the fact that it's in such contrast with what's going on like in 90% of the rest of your life.
Yeah, I guess it's choosing not to slide down into despair. And sometimes I think in North America, we forget that we can do this.
Yeah, we forget that it's an option. We're talking about embracing joy and circumstances, and your reaction to My Neighbor Totoro was one of about embracing joy. But the first time I saw this movie, I bawled, and even this time I had to fight for composure. Like, if you've ever been responsible for a little person, the fear of them being lost and all the horrible things that can happen, and the horrible thing that you know at least is definitely happening, like that they're alone and scared, it hit us home, man. Like, as an eldest daughter, I related hard to Satsuki, the elder sister.
I was also an eldest sister. In fact, I was the only sister. But I didn't have that reaction to Satsuki. I mostly admired her surety and her bravery. And maybe that's why I didn't really recognize her as having fear. I mean, concern, yes, but mostly confidence that she could find her lost little sister. Like she didn't need to stick with the adults in the search that they were doing. She could strike out on her own. But I guess I should ask, did you ever lose a younger sibling? Like even just briefly, in the grocery store or whatever?
Not that I can remember, but I'm very sure that it happened. Just, I don't think any one instance sort of sticks out in my mind. And maybe it's more my anxiety about worst case scenarios coming true that resonates with poor Satsuki so strongly. Also, I argue that she didn't have the confidence that she could find her little sister in the end. She was driven less by confidence and more by fear, I think. And that's why she begged Totoro to help her. It was kind of like a
Hmm.
last resort.
I don't know. I mean, Totoro had some pretty major special powers, and that is still Satsuki using her connections to what adults no longer have connections to, and her abilities to see what adults can no longer see in order to save her sister.
This leads me back to our discussion of conflict, because we were discussing whether Totoro even had conflict or not, and it made me curious about how it stacks up to classic ideas of conflict in stories.
Yeah, okay, especially stories with so much joy in them. Yeah, I feel like our obsession with dark dystopian stories has made us forget that conflict doesn't need to be violent or angry, and the stakes don't need to be the future of the universe or the liberation of people from tyranny. And yet, it is hard to think of what kind of conflict you could have that would add drama to positive fiction like solarpunk fiction.
Hence my curiosity. So I went looking for some 101 style explainers of the types of conflict in literature. Like some sources say there's seven, and some say there's only four, and I even found a listicle of like 24. But most tend to agree on six main types, which are the six main types that I'm familiar with. So those are the ones that I want to hold up Totoro against to see what we're dealing with.
Oh gosh, can I groan now before you start? I hate these kinds of lists. And I'm not sure they've ever helped me with storytelling. Although maybe that's why I'm not a famous writer.
Well, they do provide a useful framework for identifying what is going on in the story. So they might not help you right in that moment, but they will help you analyze what makes the writing that you like work for you. So take, for instance, the first conflict type, which is character versus self. In this case, Satsuki is the competent older sister who takes care of Mei while fighting her own needs for comfort or to cry or to be scared, especially about the fact that she too is a small child without a mother and her mother is absent and may die.
Yeah, okay. I'll totally buy that. But are there any other classically classifiable conflicts in the film?
Yeah, like as a matter of fact, the film checks quite a few of them. There's also the character versus the antagonist or other characters, which is demonstrated in the little narrative line of Satsuki versus Kenta, the neighbor's boy, which is a really tame, like child-sized version of this. Again, it's sort of that child-sized conflict where Kenta is scared and overwhelmed by her, and thus he says or does mean things, and Sasuke responds in kind. And when he's able to help her and her sister the way the adults in his life do, and which he clearly wants to do, they turn animosity into friendship.
I felt really sorry for this boy because until Satsuki was nice to him after he lent her the umbrella, he was sort of always getting the short shrift from everybody. He had to work hard in the fields, he has only ratty clothes to wear, and everyone just assumes the worst about him. But now let me take a guess. Is there a character versus nature type of story, type of conflict?
Why, yes, there is. In fact, that's number three on our list, and it's technically titled Character versus Nature or Natural Disaster. So in My Neighbor Totoro, it's the Kusakabe family versus the mom's illness. But it's also the whole village versus the potential danger to Mei when she's lost, and they all drop everything that they're doing and work on finding her.
No, okay, so it's not like the plot of a rock movie, the rock movie. Oh God, I'm an old woman. Anyways, but but still, there is a disturbing amount of story in this movie that has next to no plot.
But I mean, like, what even counts as a plot then? Because those are both clearly things that strongly affect the narrative and the main characters, which dictate their actions and emotions and how the story turns out.
I guess what I mean is that there isn't really an energetic, highly dramatic story going on in this story. The
Hmm.
characters aren't pushing for anything, they don't have any goals. The whole inciting incident, rising action, climax, resolution, and denouement elements to the story are subtle, to say the least. Until very late in the movie, when May learns that vegetables farmed by hand are very healing and decides to take the ear of corn she harvested to her mother in the hospital in order to heal her. The characters are all just floating through life, taking things as they come.
Yeah, it's not really got any obvious narrative tension to pull the story along with, although this next one is maybe the conflict that sticks out the most, because it's in the title. It's character versus the supernatural or paranormal.
Ah, okay, that one's easy. This is May and Satsuki trying to find the elusive Totoro, who only shows up when he wants to. It's also them riding inside that insanely psychedelic Cheshire cat bus that bounds along like it must be like 24 legs. I don't know, I didn't count. It seemed like a lot of legs though.
I mean, but it's also May and Sasuke versus the Soot Sprites who give over the house to them in the beginning of the film after seeing that they're kindly people. So again, it's child-sized conflict, mostly based on fear of the unknown or of the dark and what dangers it could potentially be hiding, because they have no idea what these Soot Sprites are. And I mean, like Oba-chan sort of like explains what they are, but they haven't seen them, and so it's still kind of scary. It's new to them. And there's also a very quickly resolved conflict in May versus the two smaller Totoros. Like, again, she has no idea what they are, just that they're trespassing in her home, and she doesn't know what they intend to do. And we, the audience, also don't know, so there's a potential for danger.
This whole supernatural thing could also be the healing ear of corn that May brings to her mother, which the movie sort of implies does the trick. Oh, not to give away a spoiler there.
Yes, yes, don't spoil this
Bad,
movie,
bad, Christina.
Christina. It's so new. People won't have had the chance to see it yet. But this brings us to the last two conflicts, which aren't actually really present in My Neighbor Totoro. Like there's number five, which is character versus technology or machines. And this one is interesting because Miyazaki meant for the film to be representing post-war Japan in the 50s, but the film team didn't really do their research. So while it feels like it's definitely in the past, it's not actually a definable time that can be pinned down due to technology. It's almost like this is a conflict that arises purely in the mind of the viewers who are trying to figure out the machines and timelines as the movie goes on.
No, I don't know if it was that the film team didn't do their research. That sounds pretty harsh. Because I think they meant it to be that way, right? So, and the movie mainly takes place in a rural setting. And if post-war Japan was like post-war Europe, it took decades for rural areas to tech up with things like cars, telephones, and even indoor toilets. I mean, these things were expensive and not that widely available. And so, although considering how agricultural the area is, there is a disturbing lack of even rudimentary tractors. But maybe this just serves to underscore how poor, or maybe how much a part of the natural landscape the peasants in My Neighbor Totoro's but are meant to be. But yeah, there isn't really a John Henry aspect to the movie.
John Henry? A John Henry aspect? What do you mean by that?
Oh, you don't know John Henry. That is the greatest American folk tale ever. I mean, not including any of the indigenous ones, which I'm not really versed in.
Hmm.
So John Henry was an African American freedman, and so a formerly enslaved person, right? And he was an actual person who existed, and he's now legendary. He made his living working on the railroad, hammering holes into rocks so that they could put dynamite in them to blow out a path for the tracks that they were building. This is the time when they were laying out the rail network,
Right,
what rail
yes.
network America has. um, so this being the 1870s and the start of the more industrialized aspects of the Industrial Revolution, John Henry's job gets threatened by a steam drill, which can drill faster and further than any man can, or so they say.
Mhm.
John Henry has his pride, and he's also concerned for his job. So he challenges the steam drill to a duel. Who can
Oh.
drill the furthest, the fastest? And, I don't know if it was like in an hour or, whatever, something like that. And it was a blistering battle. John Henry gave it his all, his hammer ringing out over and over and over again as he works as hard as he can. The sweat is absolutely pouring off him. It's neck and neck, if the steam drill has a neck. But anyways, because the drill keeps clogging with broken bits of rock in the borehole, because the technology wasn't very advanced at that point, John Henry wins the race. He is victorious. He has beat the steam drill.
Huh.
But then he keels over because his heart gives out and he dies, as they say, with the hammer in his hand.
Mm.
And I love this story of man versus machine, or progress, or worker versus industrialization, or, whatever angle you want to take on it. John Henry dies heroically fighting industrialization, while also helping to build the railroad that also represents a major advancement in industrialization. But, that somehow just makes it extra poignant.
Mm.
And I used to cry every time I read that story as a little kid. And
Aw.
I still feel, and Gillian Welch also has a song where John Henry comes up, and it also makes me tear up a little bit. I think is it Elvis Presley Blues? I still feel like there's a lesson in there for all of us with all the technological advancements we're facing. Like, don't wipe yourself out fighting what you're also simultaneously enabling. They might end up writing folk songs about you, although probably not. But honestly, there are better uses of your life and better ways to resist if resist is what you want to do.
Thank you for telling me that. That was really well told. Um, I was familiar with the name John Henry, but I really couldn't have told you what a John Henry aspect meant when talking about a story's plot.
Oh,
So speaking
that's just my lazy way of talking. That's all that
of,
was.
as human beings, we tend to use metaphors as shorthands for
Oh,
when
I
we're
think calling that a
communicating.
metaphor
So
is giving it way more than it deserves.
it's a synecdoche,
Oh,
basically.
that
But
sounds so professional.
speaking of which, getting back to, literary terms, the last type of conflict that we usually encounter in stories is the character versus society or social norms. And that's not really a thing in My Neighbor Totoro, except when Mei insists on being in class with Satsuki, and Satsuki is clearly annoyed. Like she's clearly trying to fit in with her new class and feels like Mei interrupts too much.
As I said earlier, the girls and their idiosyncrasies are mostly indulged as adoring or understandable given the situation. And again, sorry, I've still got Shogun on the brain. This was the opposite of Shogun, where it's dishonorable or dangerous or not even remotely allowed for people to show emotions or reveal their inner desires, and nobody gives anybody else an inch of leeway. In fact, kids and babies are just possessions of samurai or families and can be put to death without a second thought if their mother or father or grandparent, etc., or father, whatever, does something dishonorable enough to require wiping out the line. So, yay, progress. Although, gosh, um, it is fantasy, My Neighbor Totoro, something nice to aspire to. The attitude toward parenting in the movie, I mean.
Yeah, the girls get a lot of leeway because they're young, new to the village, and have a sick mother. They're kind of a triple threat that way. And parenting could seriously have been a major source of conflict in Totoro. The dad could have been strict with his daughters or forbid them to go explore in the forest, or there could have been relationship issues between him and the mother, which would affect the family.
But that would have been totally another movie. One that wasn't life affirming. One that was about how hard and wearisome life can be, instead of how much joy and magic there is to be found on Earth and in harmony with its spirits. So instead of having relationship issues, the film has the girl's father being understanding of them. And if I can come back to it, a supporter and facilitator of the sheer joy that the girls have at being alive, despite the tension of their mother's illness.
And maybe that's the conflict in this movie, Christina.
Do tell.
Deliberately finding joy in life and living it to the fullest despite of all what life throws at you. Like in Totoro, the movie, for the girls, it is moving to a new house and school, having to find new friends, and having to deal with their mother's absence and illness. For the dad, it's having to commute a fair ways to work every week, having to live in a new house, being apart from his partner, having to parent two growing girls, and who knows what he's dealing with at work.
Well, a lot, seeing as he falls asleep on his books working late at night. And in general seems to work very long hours. Like, like an academic.
Yeah, and it's clear that the technology in the countryside is pretty terrible compared to what's in the city where he works and where we assume they moved from.
Hi, you're referring to the time when she needs to use the telephone and she has to run around everywhere looking for someone who has a phone, and then it's one that you have to hand crank to get going.
That's what was on my mind. The villagers also, it's not like they're working all day in the rice paddies or cleaning houses for fun. Like it's not easy. And they've just lived through a war where undoubtedly a lot of the male villagers didn't actually come home and their entire government has just changed overnight.
Yeah, it's a pretty hand-to-mouth existence, you get the feeling. But on the
Mhm.
other hand, they do seem kind of isolated by from the effects of day-to-day politics.
I mean, still, it's got to be jarring in terms of worldview and how they interpret Japan's place in the world.
Okay, but I mean, that's all conflict that happened in the recent past of the movie, before it started. Maybe we should stick to the conflict in the movie itself. Because
I
I'm all about rules.
I was getting there. I was getting Basically, I think the conflict is more a philosophical one here. So, how can all of the characters, not just the girls, learn to live with joy in community, even despite all the terrible tragedies and hardships of their life, both the history and contemporary hardships? The movie shows us the characters doing this, them acting on and creating the joy and community. Even in sad or panicky times, like when May is lost and they think she's drowned, the neighbors come together to dredge the pond and help out as best they can.
That takes bravery, doesn't it? I wouldn't want to face that.
Mhm.
And yeah, oh my gosh, as in a Hollywood film, they'd all be bickering and they'd be ineffective and they'd be blaming each other. Maybe there'd be some fistfights, and then Bruce Willis or Tom Cruise or maybe The Rock would have to step in and save the day. And it would be clear what lesson had to be learned by the originally flawed hero in order for him to indeed save the day and get the girl. Because really, what it's all about is getting the girl.
I think even one of the lines of dialogue in My Neighbor Totoro, in response to someone thanking them for their help with dredging the pond, is something like, "It could have been any one of us." Like there's a strong sense of empathy amongst the villagers, or at least that's what it seems like to me.
They chose to be there, helping. Although,
Yeah,
I can totally see Tom Cruise saying that.
yeah, true, but he wouldn't be off screen while they did. Like I don't know who said it. It just
Ah, yeah,
was
no, yeah,
somebody's voice.
he's all about the glory. That's true.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he would have been the protagonist, right? The protagonist would have said something like that. But on the subject of choice, like Mei chose to accept Totoro as a friend. Sasuke chose to ask Totoro for help to find Mei. It doesn't seem like conflict, because the girls make it seem easy, like the natural thing to do. But actually choosing to be kind and to not assume bad intentions and to meet new things with joy and acceptance instead of fear and suspicion, to make yourself vulnerable emotionally for the sake of another, those are really hard, or at least I find them difficult.
So I think here we also have a little bit of the proverbial loss of innocence thing. I mean, they haven't got to that stage yet, right? But once you've seen or experienced a few of life's hard knocks, once you learn that the good guys don't always win and that there are wrongs that can't ever be made right again, once you start seeing the complexity of existence, that's when you stop behaving with these childish expectations of goodness and of receiving help when you ask for it.
And maybe that's when you can no longer see spirits like Totoro because you stop being able to see them as helpful at all.
Yeah, or when you can no longer ride in the slinky Cheshire cat bus unless you're on drugs.
But I think it's a valid question to put to society as a whole. Like, even despite the horrors of everyday life, can you still find it within you to choose to be good? And things go well for the girls, obviously, but at any point, they could have met with resistance or bad results for their actions and choices. But they don't.
Can you still find it within you to choose to be good? I think almost all of us are corruptible. Although I like to think for most of us, it would take situations really, really extreme, like war or a life or death struggle, or being put into some sort of impossible, violent, morally complicated situation to actually corrupt us into choosing to be bad. But I will also say that plenty of people do bad without ever admitting to themselves that what they're doing is bad. So I
Mm.
think that this isn't the most black and white question. Wouldn't most people say that they've chosen to be good, even if they've done as many or more selfish, cruel things as the rest of us? Who doesn't see themselves as being intrinsically good, even if, maybe they're also sometimes filled with self-loathing?
I kind of see what you mean. Even someone who believes in original sin and thinks that they are a bad person deserving of guilt is still kind of obsessing over themselves and what they have done, or what they assume that they are from the get-go. So while they probably don't think of themselves as quote unquote good in the sense that their religion defines it, they still suffer from that protagonist syndrome where they think that they're the most important person in the room. Or am I way off base with this?
What you are is making me feel extremely relieved that I grew up in a non-religious household. Is that really what Christians wander around feeling? That they're basically scum for something some woman did at the mythical beginning of time, more or less. From the outside looking in, that really feels like it explains a lot about what's wrong with modern Western society and why so many men seem to hate us women so much, and why so
Mm-hmm.
many people struggle with feelings of self-worth.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Uh, okay. Really? Oh,
It's
okay.
a different conversation, and
Okay.
I'm being very unnuanced with this and making a blanket statement, but basically, yes.
Oh, I'm just gonna give humanity a collective hug there. And now I'm just gonna say, but all this talk about guilt made me think of yeah, he's now an old man, but my spouse grew up with he grew up around the corner from in a little village in East Germany, and they're all pretty heavy drinkers there. And at some point or another, this guy killed somebody while drunk driving. I assume he went to jail for it for a while. I don't know because this was, before my time there. And it's probably been like 25 or 30 years, something like that. I see him as someone who seems to go out of his way to do good things for other people. And I don't know if this is his way of dealing with the guilt, which has got to be crippling, of having killed an innocent person, or if that's just the person he always was. I don't know because I didn't know him before. But in the little village that spouse comes from, everybody is grumbly and negative and always has bad things to say out of the blue and without provocation to your face and behind your back. I mean, talk
Mhm.
about a culture that chose not to choose joy and kindness. But he is a glaring exception to that.
I wish his neighbors, aside from you and your spouse, Christina,
Oh,
were.
we live hundreds of miles away.
Oh, okay. Well, that elderly guy, wherever he is now, good for him. I wish more people were like him. What an environment to grow up around. Actually, that's another conflict that could totally be explored in a Solarpunk story. It probably fits in with that number five that we discussed about a character versus society or social norms. But in a Solarpunk world, what if a neighborhood acts one way and the protagonist does not? Like, what if, despite their neighbor's best efforts, they just can't be there for or support the protagonist in the way that they need?
You're making me think of I think it was a Stephen King story I read like a million years ago where there's a guy and he refuses to get fat because he's been chosen to be the sacrifice that everybody eats once a year. So he's rejecting the social norms.
Oh,
Eventually he discovers Brazil nuts and then he gets big and anyways, it's very horrible. I won't tell you how it
that
ends,
is
but
so weird. I mean, I assume it ends in human sacrifice, probably.
But anyways, that's
Uh,
a not solar punk version
yeah,
of a
no.
short story
I
about
don't think that
fighting
would be a
social
solar punk
norms.
story or
Anyways,
society.
but okay, but the flip side of that and finding the joy in struggling against horrible social norms would be interesting. I mean, and that would be a serious struggle.
Yeah, right. And it's like it's not a situation that's going to go away. So even if we do live in a society that has stopped polluting or invests in rewilding and uses renewable and clean energy and all that, like technology can't make humans not act like humans, as messy and wonderful and frustrating and fun and enraging as we can be to each other. That, to me, is the reason why techno-utopianism just won't work, because all the advanced tech in the world won't mean that we've actually worked on ourselves to overcome our impulses to be suspicious of, or mean to, or even violent towards each other.
Or at least techno-utopianism won't work on its own.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so this is kind of something I think about a lot. Because we're super clever critters. I mean, we are great at building stuff and at inventing tech to solve problems and inventing tech so we can get more stuff done faster with less of our own personal effort. We come up with ever more incredible machines, and we have this increasing dominance over our environment because we can accumulate knowledge over time and transmit it down a long chain of generations. But what we aren't able to accumulate over generations is wisdom.
Mm.
Wisdom is something that, if you're lucky, you personally accumulate over your lifetime through experience and by ruminating on information from stories, movies, your religion, etc. Although these aren't necessarily all always good sources of information or morality.
Yeah.
This accumulation of wisdom over time through experience and processing is a good part of the reason why people become generally kinder and more patient and more accommodating of other people as they get older. Also, I think the hormone levels go down. That probably also helps. But human society does not become wise as it ages.
Oh.
So the human race is stuck in the situation where we've grown incredibly powerful down through the millennia as we've developed these incredible technologies and commandeered so much power over energy sources. But we haven't grown any wiser than any population of people on Earth ever was. And that is an increasingly more terrifying divergence. We're like totally self-absorbed, totally gossipy, totally short-sighted, totally short-tempered, totally insecure tweens playing with farming, chemical plants, capitalism, rockets, space stations, satellites, and nuclear weapons and drones.
Okay, I don't disagree with you on the point that overall humanity is pretty immature. I think there are probably some societies that there's different levels across the globe, you know? There's
Some are
maturity and
more
then there's
prone to
maturity.
temper tantrums than others. I'll give you that.
Yes. Yes. But I'm gonna gently push back actually on most of what you said because I think that we actually do have wisdom traditions or vehicles for handing down accumulated wisdom and knowledge, but we're just very, very bad at taking them
I
seriously.
think we're very bad at grasping them until we've walked a mile in their shoes, and that's experience, and that takes years. Anyways, go on.
Mhm. Well, for example, like you have wisdom traditions in religion, like Buddhism, where there's a guru and their disciples, or in medieval Christianity with monks and nuns and lay people who followed a particular saint's interpretation of the scriptures. There's also, as a secular example, philosophy and philosophers, or in some cultures, there's, like elders who impart, like the wisdom of generations onto younger folks. But since their job is to point out how terrible we're being to each other generally, they tend to get sidelined or even actively persecuted for being, well, basically killjoys if they state things a little bit too strongly. Like the most famous example in history is Socrates, but a contemporary example would be Sarah Ahmed. So they're people who try to share knowledge, but the society and institutions that they're part of resist their calls for change to the point of excommunicating them or, you know, even murdering them.
So, yes, totally. I wasn't saying that we. So, I mean, imagine how lost in the woods we'd be without these traditions shining lights along the paths through darkness. And yet, I still think it takes a single person a lifetime to achieve wisdom, even with guidance from these traditions that have been built up over dozens of human lifetimes. It's like you said, it's the elder who's telling the young people what, the wisdom they've accumulated over their lifetime, even with some information and guidance from the elders that came before them. It's not the young people who are instantly getting the wisdom, like grasping it, like it's not making
Yes.
them instantly wise.
Yeah.
Okay, and to show you how far I've made it, I have to say I cannot hear about Socrates without thinking be excellent to each other and party on.
A Bill and Ted style of morality wouldn't be a bad thing for all of us to start out with as a baseline. But coming back to the reason why techno-utopia wouldn't actually work, because it doesn't account for the human, I think that's why it's really important that Solarpunk recognizes the diversity of the human experience and acknowledges and embraces things like neurodiversity, different abilities, races, genders, sexualities, and all the like weird and wonderful bits of who we are. Because if it didn't, it probably wouldn't work. We'd all just be jerks to each other, and instead of our guided missiles being launched using fossil fuel, they'd be launched with renewable energy. And to deal with that kind of large scale conflict, I think it's important to get it right on the small scale first, starting with how kids relate to each other and to nature. It's kind of on the adults around them, like Mei and Sasuke's dad and Oba-chan, and even the villager adults, to demonstrate their care for each other and their respect for the non-human world. Then maybe when Sasuke or Mei reach like college or something, they're able to channel all that joy and care into their interactions with others, even in stressful situations, if they come into bigger situations of conflict in their lives.
So I think that, all in all, My Neighbor Totoro is definitely a bright, shining light of an example of the types of conflict you can have in solarpunk stories, as well as being a bit of, wisdom that maybe can sprinkle a bit of its fairy dust on you as to how to embrace joy and
Here's
live
hoping.
life with wonder.
I said, here's hoping.
These stories don't have to fall into the pit a lot of utopian fiction falls into, where the stories seem to hinge on individual characters struggling with having to conform to the rigid lack of individualism called for by their brutally communitarian societies. So the conflict can be small scale and yet profound, because even in a harmonious landscape where the possibility for life to be good is high, there will always be differences of opinion, intention, and goals between characters. And life will always throw in challenges like sickness, aging, accidents, and death. And these conflicts can be solved without resorting to arguments, literal physical fighting, or warfare.
Problems can also be larger scale and diplomatic, and involving having to avert conflict or crises between societies or groups of people in societies, as you said, with different aims, intentions, or ways of getting things done. And these conflicts can be dramatic and involve serious consequences. But in solarpunk storytelling, they don't require a hero or a superhero to resolve in the traditional aggressive, generally ultimately physical manner. There can be negotiation, compromise, accommodation, sympathy, reconciliation, and understanding involved as people work to resolve conflicts between them or their societies.
So get out there and read and write solarpunk. We need visions like these.
And get out there and face life with joyfulness and choose to do good in this world when you're able.
And that's a wrap for this bonus episode. Don't forget to support us on Patreon and subscribe to our YouTube. And in the meantime, stay solarpunk. Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel, Kroon, and Christina de la Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay solarpunk.